We are live. Welcome everybody to our NCTE session, Containing Multitudes, How Teachers Balance Life and Writing Too. I am Mitch Novis. I'm going to do the kickoff here, and then we're going to go around and get everybody else a chance to talk here before we're done. In short, we are going to talk today with you about how to balance, let me just write in the title, how to balance teaching and writing. To best teach writing, it's good to be a writer also. And many of us in this Zoom room, have been participants in National Writing Project Summer Institutes and other events before. Some of us are involved in leadership of National Writing Project sites. And so in some ways, our entire session is indebted to the National Writing Project because one of their guiding tenets is to better teach writing. It helps to be a writer, to live the writing life so that we can share that with our students as well. And that's ultimately what we're getting at here today is how did we each get to a point where we finally started to call ourselves not just teachers, but writers. You know, it's when people ask you what you do, you often just say I'm a teacher, but everybody in this room can also, introduce themselves as a writer. And that's one way to nutshell this whole session. How did we manage to carve out time and space in our lives to do that, to become writers in addition to teaching? And a big part of this is an embrace of vulnerability, of sharing your own writing in rooms. If anybody out there watching this has been a National Writing Project participant before, you know that scary first step of writing something and then huddling in a circle and sharing it perhaps for the first time. For many of us, we came through the school system before we did writing process work. So for some of us, it was literally the first time you ever shared your writing with somebody else. For others, it might be the first time since 9th grade. I don't know. But either way, there's that scary embrace of vulnerability. So we wanted to lead off with that today, this notion that thank you for joining us, and you'll probably hear a few times here this notion that we all have had to overcome some shyness hurdle, a vulnerability hurdle, that we have to pull back the curtain on our own personhood in some ways to talk about what it means to be a writer and to be a writer as well. We're each going to, let me introduce the whole session. We're each going to give a spiel about kind of our own little corner of the teachers as writers life. And then we're going to go to kind of a panel discussion. Imagine us all sitting on a stage together, talking about the teaching and writing life. That's basically our format, okay? So first up today is Paul Shepard. So I have the honor of introducing Paul, and then he's going to give us his spiel. Paul is a former faculty advisor of a college newspaper, correct? That part's former, I think. Yes. Yeah. Former faculty advisor of a college newspaper, literary magazine, and radio station. He is also a writer in residence in Florida State University's creative writing program. He is the author of the Mary McCarthy award-winning novel, More Like Not Running Away, which was also named one of 10 best adult/young adult crossover novels for the 2005 to 2010 timeframe. His writing has appeared in Crazy Horse, Prairie Schooner, and Omni. He calls high school teaching the most rewarding and meaningful work he has done. So Paul Shepard, take it away.
Well, thank you, Mitchell, for that introduction, and welcome everyone here. I have had a lifelong interest in the imagination. I think we come to writing because we like to access our imaginations. We're interested in what happens when we're in that world. And as teachers, I think we're trying to figure out how can we bring that to our students. And so I wanted to start with reading a poem that has inspired me to do this many times. It's Billy Collins' Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose, to find out what it really means. So this is an inspiration for a project I'm working on called To Hell with Reading, To Hell with Writing, and To Hell with Literature, which asks broad questions about how can we bring more imagination to what we're teaching? How can we bring the imagination we have as writers into the classroom? Some of the questions I'm interested in as a teacher are, what is a broader definition of reading? Does it include listening, watching? Does it include more practical skills? Conversations with parents? And the same with writing. I know we write essays, we write short answer questions, we write AP essays, but I wonder if writing is also, if discussion can be a part of what we're trying to learn. When we talk, when we post, when we share. I think of a carpenter who I really admire, who has posted a series of videos on how to frame a house. And I think of him as a writer. He's sharing his wisdom with the world and in a different, interesting way that he might never have done if it had to be limited to what he put on a page. And the same with literature. I think our definition of literature now includes so much film and even short video. YouTube has made great inroads into what we might consider literature. And so I'm interested in how, as teachers, we can bring this world to our students, as well as the worlds that of reading novels and writing papers that, you know, we've been required to do. My prompt that I think gets to the base of this, which I ask, and you'll see these prompts, I think, posted at the end. But if I had 20 students for 5 hours a week for an entire year and could teach them anything that I thought would better prepare them for the world, without concerns for state mandates or school policies, the demands of parents, or whatever central offices are doing, what would we teach them? What's the most important thing they could learn from us? And then, could we really do that? What if we made that our goal? So I'm honored to be here among these great writers and teachers, and I think I have reached my time, so I want to say thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Thomas Warren. And Thomas is not only a friend of mine, but he's a terrific teacher. He's been teaching for 12 years. He's our department chair. He's a varsity soccer coach, teaches the creative writing program in our school, and has done a great job of it. Father, husband, and writer. And he's tells me here that he earned $5 for publishing 2 poems. That's more than most of us have made. Anyway, he's the advisor for our student literary magazine. I've been fascinated to watch Thomas write with our students and for them to see him write. I think that's been an inspiration. So Thomas Warren.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and hello to everyone out there. So what I'm going to talk about for just a few moments here really is what Paul just sort of introduced, is the idea of writing alongside my students. And so when we were making our introductions and preparing this, I very purposely put all of these sort of hats that I wear just to point out that, like, I'm busy. And I know that so is everyone else out there, right? When you're a teacher, there are so many different things you have to do. And so really, I have found, as I have been teaching the creative writing course at my school, that it has been the safest space, not only for my students, but for myself as a writer too, where I know that there is consistent time where I can write as well. And so I am not sure, like, I think oftentimes, you know, we hear about silent sustained reading, and best practice is to read along with your students. And so I firmly believe that writing along with your students is also really good practice. And so there's a couple of ways that I do that. One is just setting time. when we have our creative writing course, we're guaranteed every class there's 30 minutes of writing time. And this is a little bit different. I know that, you know, in your English course, like asking kids to sit and write for 30 minutes silently is a hard ask. But in creative writing, these are kids that want to do that. The best and most interesting observation I ever had with a principal is when he came in smack in the middle of a writing time and not a single student looked up, said a word, did anything. He just walked in, saw silent kids for 5 minutes straight and walked out. He didn't even know the prompt was there actually, because my screen had fallen asleep. So it just was a room of silence. But so I write along with them. And so when I'm talking about building community, something else that I often do, especially with poetry, because I know that that is the genre that they are most uncomfortable with sharing because it can kind of get to the heart of things quickly. I will usually give a prompt and then I will go right to that prompt on the whiteboard. And I often do it as an exercise with them, not to show that like I am a fantastic writer or anything like that, but rather that the writing itself is a process. I very often, after sharing these things or we write when the time is up, I'll go and I'll ask students, hey, what did you write? Was there something that you really enjoyed? And kids will, you know, some will share their entire piece of writing, others will share bits and pieces. I will often go through that thing that I've written on the board and I'll say, well, here's the parts that I really like from this. And I'll pull, rather than saying this whole thing is great, I'll pull the, you know, 5, 6, 7 lines that I really enjoyed out of the entire thing. And I'll say, this is where I go next time. When this turns to my journal, those are the lines I've got. So that's one thing. In terms of the students and building confidence with them and in themselves, I have a forced vulnerability is really what happens. On day one in creative writing, I have the kids take an oath. They have to write it themselves. And the one thing that I guarantee is going to be in there is that they have to have absolutely no disclaimers. You cannot disclaim your writing at any point ever. And I live that too. And so it doesn't matter if what I wrote on the board is amazing or not, no disclaimers. I own it, I made it, it's from me. And then the other thing is, that was day one. Day two is a reading. Right away, they'll have to have written something that night. And the next day we are standing in front of each other and sharing it. And it is nerve-wracking for everyone, including myself. But it's also out of the way, and it is such a quick community builder. When you tell kids that like, we are here together and this is your tribe, and we are only here to become better writers, it is amazing that after forcing them to share, how quickly they will dive in and be willing to write in more vulnerable ways. And so that's sort of what I do and how I make time as a writer. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Angela, and I'm going to do the introduction for her. So Angela is a college instructor for English and Education and the co-director of the Eastern Michigan Writing Project. She is the Writing Retreat co-director, a former K-12 teacher of 27 years. She's taught and directed summer youth camps for creative writing, and she's published several educational articles as well as a poem. And then self-published 5 novels that were originally drafted during NaNoWriMo.
Thanks, Thomas. So I started doing NaNoWriMo with one of my college friends, and we did this in secret and didn't tell anyone, and crashed and burned the first year because the only measure of success is quantity. To win NaNoWriMo, you have to write 50,000 words of original prose. The restrictions on that have changed a little, and now there are Nano Rebels as well. So if you're not into fiction, you could do creative nonfiction or poetry. So you could just open a Word doc and start typing, sign up on the website, create an account, and posting your word count is all based on the honor system. It's not until the very end that you copy and paste your novel into their robot that verifies whether or not you produced 50,000 words. Their servers are not big enough to save all of our novels, so they immediately count and delete all of the novels. After the second year, my friend and I tried again, and we won the second year. And after that, we were more willing to admit that we were writers, that we had tried to write 2 novels. And then by the time I was getting ready to write my 3rd novel, I had an amazing group of kids, and we had our writing class, and we had our literature circle discussion. And when we finished the book, the kids said, well, what are we going to read next? And I said, well, what do you think about writing your own novel? And so by that point, Chris Beatty, who had started the original NaNoWriMo, had added the Young Writers program. And so there are, so I convinced a group of 6th graders that they were going to write their own novel. Now the adults have to do 50,000, but the young writers can choose their own word count goal. And so after some negotiations, they decided that 10,000 would be a fair word count starter for 6th graders. So since 2006, I've done NaNoWriMo every year, not only for myself, but also with a group of students. So next slide, please. So everybody, well, lots of people say that someday they'd like to write a novel. And so Chris Beatty was sitting around in the Bay Area of California with his friends one night and realized that the only thing stopping them was the lack of a deadline. So the biggest thing separating people from their artistic ambitions is not a lack of talent, it's the lack of a deadline. Give someone an enormous task, a supportive community, and a friendly yet firm due date, and miracles will happen. And so the only thing stopping me from attempting my great American novel was that deadline, and NaNoWriMo gave me that. This is my 17th year of NaNoWriMo, and the number is updated every time I update my word count this month. So it'll only take me another 3 or 4 years to get to 1 million words. And they say the first million are the hardest, right? So next slide, please. So these are the Young Writers posters to show that, yes, I do write with my students. Their word count, I generally recommend 10,000 for the first timers, but middle school students have challenged themselves to write 20 or 25 or even 50,000 words. Because they figure if I can write lesson plans and grade papers and write a 50,000 word novel, then so can they. So I've had a couple of 8th graders try it and a couple succeed. So my books, so there's my anthology in which I have published a poem. The 3 smaller books on the left were lightly edited. Hopefully I fixed all the typos, but some plot holes might still remain. But For What It's Worth is the first novel that I planned out start to finish and actually knew where it was going when I started it. And it's also the novel that my sister told her book club about before she told me that she told her book club. So my very first book club experience, I was invited as the author. And they asked me questions about what happened to this character who disappeared. And I laughed and said, I don't know. And they got really mad at me. So in the future, I promise I will. Last year I drafted that story. And it's a big mess because it was a draft. And so in the future, I do promise to write her story as a completely separate book. Looking for Words is the one I'm most proud of. It is 4 years of NaNoWriMo and 3 years of editing, including 3 English teachers and an architect. So that one is my latest novel that was released last September. So the great thing about writing with my kids, like Thomas said, is that it gives you authority. And like he said about turning off the inner editor, the Young Writers site actually has an official turn off the inner editor, this oath that we all take and sign. So that little voice in our head that tells us we're not very good, it goes away from that month. So when you give yourself permission to write badly, you don't worry about how good it is. And so the only measure of success is quantity, and that gives us a great deal of fun. So I do publish under a pseudonym because one of my colleagues actually told my students that I published my books on Amazon. And so they, of course, promptly went and looked up Angela Knight on Amazon. And my students took one look at her covers and went, I don't think those are hers. So, which is one reason I had to choose a pseudonym. The other is exactly to keep them from looking it up. because some of my characters might not have the cleanest vocabularies that I enforce at school. So that is my story. And now I will introduce Shannon. Shannon is the author of the forthcoming novel Whimsy, published by Long Day Press in 2021. Her writing has appeared in Tim House, Prairie Schooner, Hobart, and the anthology Teacher Voice, among other publications. She is a National Writing Project teacher consultant and a former youth slam poetry coach. Born in Detroit, she now lives in Virginia, where she teaches high school English. And you can find Shannon on her website at www.shannon-mcleod.com. Shannon?
Hi, thanks, Angela. Yeah, so for me, my identity as a teacher and a writer, I've kept very separate for a long time. For that same reason that Angela mentioned about her characters not necessarily having the same vocabulary as herself as a teacher. So it's represented in my name as well. I publish under my maiden name, McLeod, and I teach under my married name, Mound, because I've just always been really paranoid about kind of being found out as a writer, not only by my students, but also by my colleagues. So I'm only just starting to kind of integrate those two identities at my current teaching job, where I've met Paul and Thomas and started to meet teachers who proudly call themselves writers and practice writing alongside their students. So that experience has been really, really helpful to me as a writer and as a teacher, because like Thomas was mentioning about that vulnerability, I'm finding it's so important, again, both for myself and for my students. I got more serious about writing at the end of my college career, and I wrote a couple of novels. I started writing using NaNoWriMo after Angela told me about NaNoWriMo through the National Writing Project. So that's something that I've done personally, but I've also done with my students, and that's been a really exciting project. But yeah, so I'm finding also through different writing communities a way to sort of integrate myself as a teacher and a writer. Through school, I've done creative writing clubs, and that's part of the time when I get to do my writing. And also I coached a youth slam poetry team where they competed at Louder Than a Bomb. So it was really great to see my students write and perform. And when your kids show that sort of vulnerability, you can't help but feel like as an adult, you need to step up too. And they're really inspiring to me. But like I said, I've been very shy about sharing even with my students that I'm a writer. I'm a little paranoid about them finding my writing online. I think in the current climate, I feel a little defensive of my writing identity, so I'm protective of it. But I don't necessarily want to be that way because I see the value in writing with students. But yeah, we'll see. The novella that's coming out in spring is a story about a teacher inspired by picking up one too many books about teachers having affairs with students and shows about teachers like selling drugs. I'm like, I want to write a story about a teacher who does not do one of those things. And I wanted to kind of escape that trope. So writing that book, Whimsy, I think was also kind of part of my journey of integrating my writer self and my teacher self. So that's something I'm looking forward to and just continuing to write both with my students and outside of work. With that, I will introduce Mitch Novis. Mitch is a K-12 teacher in Metro Detroit and co-directs the Red Cedar Writing Project at Michigan State University. He's in his 25th year as a teacher and his 5th year as a published writer. He co-wrote Real Writing, Modernizing the Old School Essay, and has published 30 or so poems in literary magazines like Hobart, Dunes Review, Porcupine Literary, and more. You can find links and details at mitchnovis.com.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the intro there. I am going to talk mostly off slides. I want to kind of get into the, coming back to that vulnerability theme you've already heard come up a few times here. How do you get over that hump? So National Writing Project has come up a few times. And I should also point out, quick side note, I'm the one running the slides. So whenever things are wiggling around, that's my touch mouse's fault. I'm sorry, I'm clumsy. Got these big old hammy fingers. I wanted to try to go back and point out that this slideshow is available for you all to follow along. I should have said this at the intro. So here is a short web address. If you want to access these slides, some of these things have links, right? And I say that because mine has a lot of links. So I'm going to go back for a second, pause on this screen while I intro and say, if you want to click on any of these links, this Google slide deck is available to you. Let me get back up. So I am a co-director of Red Cedar Writing Project, which is Michigan State University's site of the National Writing Project. And I think like anybody who's in this session right now, you enjoy writing, or at least you've thought about writing. And I was definitely in that same boat. And I heard about Michigan State's writing projects. I knew nothing. I was a third-year teacher. I could barely brush my teeth, let alone figure out how to investigate writing and teaching. And somebody dropped off a pamphlet. I'm old. This was pamphlets, right? Not websites, to go to the Red Cedar Writing Project. And I said, yes, I love teaching and writing. And it was through that process that I realized that writers have to show their writing to other people, that you can't just write in notebooks and call it good. You can, absolutely, but not if you want to get published, right? And so over time, I went into this just, being gung-ho about teaching writing. And then I became, our then director invited me to come be a co-facilitator for the Summer Institute. It's this, if you don't know NWP, it's this big teacher professional learning network. And every summer there's this intensive Summer Institute, and I was in it for 10 years. So if you think about Malcolm Gladwell's whole 10,000 hours thing, like my 10,000 hours were in, rooms at Michigan State University's campus, and getting used to showing people thoughts that came out of my brain, right? Half-baked half the times, because first drafts, as Anne Lamott famously pointed out, are not great. But one thing a lot of National Writing Project sites do are these things called writing marathons. And that was a big switch flip for me, because Natalie Goldberg has this book, Writing Down the Bones, and somewhere in there, I forget where, else I would have included a citation, she tells a story about writing with some people. And writing, the whole idea of a writing marathon is you go out in public and you write at a cafe, you write at a restaurant, you write at the park, and then you just read around, and you're not allowed to comment on each other's stuff. And that's the key. And Goldberg said, if you must say something, you can say, damn, you're a writer. And that was this seismic shift, not just for me, but for the people coming through the Red Cedar Writing Project also. And it became tradition. Every year when we would do a writing marathon, we would just tell them, you can say that. And okay, so there's a cuss word in there, but hey, you got to get over some, uncomfortable stuff to become a writer, right? And so I kept doing that. And then eventually people said, Mitch, you should try to put some of this stuff out there. And smart people would then go get an MFA where they teach you about these things. I instead just Googled a whole lot and checked out the Writer's Market book from the library and stuff like that, and just kept at it. And that's kind of why I wanted to include some links, because over these years working with our writing project site, a lot of other people have expressed interest. And so how do you get started publishing? You heard in our bios a lot of literary magazines thrown out there. How do you even get in a literary magazine? And there's kind of a big mysterious question mark for folks that haven't looked into that before. And so you go back to that bit.ly and track down this slide deck, and these links here will give you some ideas of where to even find these things. I'm not going to do a full walkthrough or just do an introduction stuff right now, but if you click through these links, you'll get some good pointers. They'll take you to the literary magazines themselves, and they tell you what they're looking for. They tell you how to submit. So if you're thinking right now, how do I even do this? Poke around some of these links, and they'll tell you who the different literary magazines are if you're not familiar with them yet. Whether you email your stuff to them or submit on this website called Submittable. That's kind of the ins and outs is just digging through those websites. Oops, I got ahead of myself here. So we've heard along the lines here, a couple of different people have mentioned like writing with the students and things like that. I want to advocate, and I guess it'd be the fourth bullet there. When do you find time to write? I forced myself about 10 years ago to start being antisocial at work, which sounds terrible. And a lot of people who have worked with me right now are going like, oh, that explains a lot. I didn't join folks at lunch, at least not every day. I would take like 2 or 3 days a week at lunch to hunker down and like, devour a yogurt in 30 seconds and then spend 15 minutes working on my writing and researching what those literary magazine websites are and things like that. And then like almost no TV. Like whenever somebody says like, hey, did you see Game of Thrones? I'm like, nope. Like I watch very little TV. So like you've got to kind of carve out time to tackle these things if you are interested in putting it out there. Obviously persistence. I had my submittable page open, but I accidentally closed it. So I was gonna go to it and show you the hundreds of rejections that you get when you start throwing things out there. They're gray and submittable, and it's just like this huge string of gray. And then community, a shout out to social media. Social media is actually part of what generated this session itself in the first place. That it's tough to do these things without a sense of community, without any community. And if you don't have fellow teacher writers nearby, social media can be a good place to get that. That was kind of where I found, I should say, a writers community of my own, was largely through Twitter and finding cool writers on Twitter and other teacher writers on Twitter. That's literally the genesis of this session, was teacher writers connecting on social media. So shout out to forming community. And then I forgot, I missed one slide. So I'm gonna bounce back to SlideShare real quick. And then just a point that this does all come back and connect to our professional lives in the classroom as well. That writing, if we go all the way back to the first thing I said in the intro, that teachers as writers become better teachers by writing. That's kind of one of the biggest benefits, is that we're asking our students to write. So if we put ourselves in the vulnerable position of sharing a piece with somebody else and asking for feedback, of sending it out to an editor who you don't know, like the ultimate, like, hey, here, judge me on these 39 words in a poem. And think about how that feels for our students turning things into us to look at. It really can be a total game changer for the teaching life, not just the writing life. And then that last bullet on here, that it lends credibility. Really, I think this came up. I think Thomas might have mentioned this, that we gain a bit of cred, right? That when we're doing a writing conference with our students, they'll tend to listen closer because they know that we're writing as well, right? And then we can model writing, like Kelly Gallagher's book. Like if they know you're a writer, you can show them some stuff. Or if you don't know you're a writer, if you hide this stuff, but you're more comfortable sharing it, your own, like writing something on the screen in front of the kids, they'll, tune in a little bit more sometimes. And then, it has impact on professional learning as well, that then, when I do go to lunch, I can talk with peers about how this has helped me as a teacher, that kind of water cooler professional talk. Having gone through the submitting and getting rejected and occasionally a piece accepted process has really helped on the professional conversation side of things as well. Okay, at this point in our session, we're going to have a kind of a panel conversation, a little Q&A amongst ourselves, amongst the 5 of us. So does anybody have a question to kick us off?
Yeah, so listening to everybody here, I immediately, as sort of like the least, I guess, published of the colleagues here, was wondering for Paul, Angela, and Shannon, just to talk a little bit about their prose publishing experience and sort of the stories for those.
Like Mitch, I started submitting and publishing short stories and personal essays primarily using Submittable, and also learning about the community, the writing community, through Twitter. Like I didn't know anything about journals except for what I could find at Barnes & Noble when I first started writing, but then through connecting with other writers on Twitter and following one journal that followed and promoted another, like I started to get more familiar with the literary journal scene and what sorts of journals published what sorts of things. And I feel like it takes a long time to familiarize yourself with like the publication community to figure out who to send what type of writing. Like, I think when I first submitted, I submitted to like Granta or like all these big journals that I saw in Barnes and Noble, and now I cringe thinking about the sort of writing that I sent them. But it was like, you know, the first step in that process. So that was it was a good experience, you know, a lot of failure until you have some success. So that's a story with short stories, and I still submit through Submittable. For novels, I wrote a couple novels that went nowhere, but I queried agents using, I learned about that through a series at my local library where authors were talking about how to query agents and write a query letter. And the website Query Shark also helped me, because that's an art that's really difficult, is writing a query letter. And I've never written a successful query letter either. I've sent a lot of them for 3 novels. But the novella that's coming out, I got that publication deal with an indie publisher through a writing contest. So that was through Submittable as well. It was going to come out with one indie publisher. That indie publisher folded, but the editors that I worked with took my project on through their other press. So they're all kind of interconnected. And over the summer, an agent read one of my stories online and reached out to me. So that's how I ended up signing with an agent. So hopefully I won't have to kind of cold pitch my novels in the future.
Very cool. Paul or
Thank you,
Angela,
Paul.
what's your story?
Well, my story started a long time ago. I might be the only one here who remembers sending things through the mail. And that was a real pain. Back then, a lot of magazines you had to submit, or you couldn't simultaneously submit. And so you'd send a poem out and wait for 6 months for the rejection and then send it to somebody else. Somebody told me right at the beginning, they said, send everything to the New Yorker first. You know they're going to reject it, get it over with. And it really helped. And so I sent everything to the New Yorker. I mean, I aimed higher than Granta. I went for the, but it was great. And I framed my first rejection. Our friend framed it for me. I had saved it. That was, that's how it got started. And then my wife has helped me keep up with it sometimes because it gets complicated. I've been through a lot of different, I've had, like Shannon, I've had a book accepted and then the press folded. And had an agent with William Morris Agency. And that went on for a while and that was pretty interesting. But wound up, I'm not that sellable. So I went out on my own and went with a literary press for my novel. Yeah, I think couple things. One is, the thick skin that I never developed as much as I wish I had. I haven't sent anything out for a few years now, but I know that helps a lot of writers. I'll add this. I've been the editor of a literary magazine, International Quarterly, for a few years. And so advice from that end, I would say, is, that first page makes all the difference. When we are reading, 100 stories a week, you know by the first page if someone's in control of the narrative. And so it takes, it is well worth working on getting that, making sure that the first page at least where someone gets past that, because unfortunately often editors don't. With poetry, it's another ball game, Anyway, that's my advice and what I've learned. I've had very good luck with my Saraband press. Has been terrific, though. I want to shout out to them. They did an incredible job, and I do think it makes a big difference having a press that was working hard for you. They got good reviews and helped with tours and all that. And that was worth waiting for. So,
Thanks, Paul. So I did not send anything out to anyone. I have never queried anything in my life. That's not true, except for my educational articles and my poem. But for my novels, I went ahead and self-published for the immediate gratification and for the creative control. The first 3 covers were just create space templates that I uploaded my own photos to. And then the more recent novels, the For What It's Worth and Looking for Words. My best friend's a graphic designer, and so we operate very much on the barter system, where I babysit her kids and she creates my covers. So that works out well for us. For the first 4, I was my own editor for the most part, which is why plot holes and mistakes probably still remain. For the more recent one, where I was combining so many years of Nanowrimo, I did have 4 other people read it and give me feedback before I finally published it. And in Looking for Words as well, there are several sections where the type is actually crossed out. And I'm not sure if an editor would have actually let me get away with that or not. But if you have to read all the way to the end to find out why that fits and why it works. So I also like it very much when Amazon gives me money. So.
Tell me more about this making money off of your writing.
It's really neat. They send you an email and saying that there's going to be a deposit in your account in the next 2 to 5 days, and they don't tell you how much. And then you obsessively compulsively check your bank account for the next 2 to 5 days until it actually shows up. And then you find out it's like 35 cents, which is fine because it means somebody bought, one of my 99-cent Kindle novels, which the first 3 are only 99 cents on Kindle. So, but that's okay. But I'm also in the Kindle Unlimited program, which pays the authors based on how many pages actually get read. And so my first Kindle Unlimited check was $30. So that was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
So, and then Mitch mentioned poets and writers, and my graphic designer also created an ad. So I will have an ad in the January, February edition of Poets and Writers magazine for that book as well.
Awesome. I will keep my eyes peeled for it.
Thanks.
Yeah. I kind of have a question, and I'm just going to throw this out there. That was, I am so impressed when I hear stories like Thomas getting up in front of the class and writing a poem on the whiteboard, and participating in the NaNoWriMo with your students, and them knowing that you're engaged in this too. I think it's just wonderful to see how you build that confidence with your students by example. What happens when you falter? What happens when you feel like Thomas, when you get up there and it's like, I don't know what to say now. What do you do?
Well, so I think that a lot of the credibility of being a writer from writing in front of them is not necessarily the quality of the writing, but more so just that I am like actively in the process of being a writer. Like I'm trying so hard, and they see me doing it, and they see the falters, and then they also see the gems. I mean, that kind of is part of that. Like an anecdote, I wrote probably the worst poem of my life on the whiteboard in front of them. I don't remember the entire thing, but it had the words like teenage werewolf in it because I was just going. And that became like forever a joke in the class. If anything, like it built more community around us. And just that, like when a kid was writing a poem or was writing something and they didn't really know where it was going or didn't like it, suddenly a teenage werewolf appeared in that piece of work. And like, and so it even the failure sort of actually became a confidence builder in that situation.
That's so great.
That's very cool. I would do a quick piggyback off that. That if we're trying to show them, like, because really what you're doing is you're revealing the writing process, you know. And Kelly Gallagher has a whole book about this. I always forget titles. Right, like this, I think it is, where he makes the point that, like, regardless, you're the best writer in the room, like, because you're the most experienced writer in the room, and it's good for them to see that the most experienced writer in the room will still knock off a totally goofy first draft, right? Like, if you're writing in front of them, they'll see, like, this doesn't connect to this, and, like, yeah, that's what first drafts are like. I've done similar things and then shown the kids, like, my Dropbox. I'm a Dropbox user. Right? Every writer's got their own thing. I'll show them, like, I won't show them my poem, but I'll show them, like, the Dropbox file where you can see that, like, I do number systems. Like, I'll save, like, title of poem V1 revised, title of poem V2, and I'll show them, like, see, there are 32 versions of this poem, and it's, like, you know, not even long. It's like 12 lines long, right? To kind of give that behind the scenes on the revision process, and, like, just how insane it is to try to make something good enough, like, back to Paul's point, to make something good enough to get past the goalie at the literary magazine, right? Like, you got to get their attention. That sometimes takes a lot of drafts and a lot of those antisocial lunches, you know, tinkering with it.
The beauty of doing NaNoWriMo with kids is that it's finally something I'm not torturing them by making them do. It's something we're doing together. And so there's a huge difference than, you know, I assign, you know, an argument paper, an information paper, whatever. But for novel writing, I'm writing with them. And so I don't write young adult fiction, but I always include a teenage character. So I can always talk about, I share those stories with the kids. Like, oh, my character is doing this. And then every once in a while I'll say, you know, like, this character is going to visit the grandmother she never met. Like, what do you call your grandmother? And then that's, you know, how she became Nana in the story because one of my kids said that. So, and then in that way, they contribute to my novel as well. There's also a lot of pressure to win NaNoWriMo when you're writing with middle school students. So,
yeah.
I haven't done Nano, so just a quick follow-up question. When you say win, that just means you hit the word count and they give you the, like, blue ribbon or whatever, right?
yes.
And Angela, when you do, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
When you do NaNoWriMo with your students, are they collaborating at all, or they're all writing their individual novels?
No, they're all writing individual novels. And I've even had ELL students do this.
Wow.
I've had a student who was a brand new zero English kid in 6th grade. And by the time I had him in 8th grade, he wrote a 10,000 word novel about a kid who came to the United States and didn't know English and loved to play soccer and fell in love with a girl and couldn't do anything about it.
Hey,
I also have
how much of your writing is autobiographical?
Yeah, he was a nano rebel before he knew that existed. So
It's so encouraging to hear that. And imagine, you know, I think, Mitch, I believe you were saying how that you referenced the 10,000 hour rule, and that NaNoWriMo seems to be, because its focus is volume, a way to get kids to just write a lot. And I think, you know, writing a lot, I'm sure, especially like for an English language learner, must really break down some barriers, you know, just like seeing us when we're writing. I love hearing that this is a process, that they're watching our process unfold. And just the, but Mitchell, you started off talking about vulnerability. And I can't think of more vulnerability than being up there, you know, sharing your words that you've written, or your word counts, or your rejections. That must be that takes, you know, takes a lot of courage, I think. And it's got to be encouraging to students to see that.
I hope so.
well, the best part is when you survey them at the end and you say, you know, so what did you get out of this? And one student said, I learned that if I can write a novel in a month, I can do anything.
Wow.
And the really great part is when, you know, a friend of mine teaches high school, and she said that one of her college freshmen wrote back to her and said, you know, my first assignment was a 10-page paper, and all my classmates were freaking out. And she's like, I wrote a novel in a month. I can write a 10-page paper, no big deal.
That's so cool.
So it gives them confidence that I don't think we can help develop in any other way.
And they see you as a teacher taking it seriously. And I think they're going to take that type of writing more seriously if they see their teacher doing it too. Just like when we teach things we're interested in, our kids are more interested as well.
Oh, definitely. Well, and the fun part of Nano is I tell them, if you get stuck, like start a new chapter with another character. You know, if the dinosaurs come back and kill all your characters and you start over a next chapter with, you know, an entirely new set of cast of characters, then it doesn't matter.
Keep the dinosaur though, right? You have to have
You know, zombies, dinosaurs, you know, whatever it is.
short stories. So,
Well, Paul, I'm really interested in what you were saying about imagination in teaching, and I was just curious how that manifests in your classroom, being an imaginative teacher.
often falteringly. Writing a poem on the board every day. Yeah. I think, well, I'm going to start backwards a little bit. For me, I think assessment has become a major impediment for the imagination. I think we feel the need to put some number in a grade book so often. And so, for instance, why I'm so interested in what Angela's saying about NaNoWriMo for students is I can imagine this being either you did it or you didn't. You know, what are we going to grade your sentence structures there? It's put the words out there. I think the first thing I've tried to get rid of, and this comes from my background, I guess, in so many student and teacher creative writing workshops, is, you know, gosh, my first one in college and then all the way through grad school, it's like, you never knew what the hell you were getting. It was like, you know, at the end of the semester, professor gave you a grade, you know. I'm not suggesting that's a great way to grade things. I think assessment has caused so many students to get tied up into, so the first thing for me, the first imaginative thing is how can I do some kind of assessment that is encouraging, that opens them up. And I think, honestly, I read that Billy Collins poem because, to me, how do we assess someone who is holding the poem up to the light like a color slide? How can we assess a great conversation about a poem? You know, to have working from the back end, that was the first thing, is to try to get rid of as much of that as I can. And then student choice, try to find out what they're interested in, what they're going to be reading. The thing that I said high school is the most meaningful work I've ever done, partly because working with students who are not going to go to college or likely not going to go to college, and they're seniors. What can we read? What can we watch? How can the world of information and wisdom be accessible to them once it's not happening in the classroom, rather than it just sort of shutting down, you know? So trying to find that for each kid, I think, is the challenge that I love and often fail at, you know? So I'm curious, others though, do you find that as writers, you feel more free and imaginative in the classroom? Does the access to that creativity translate into what we have to do every day, day after day?
I think it might make you less indoctrinated with this idea that persuasive writing is the only kind of writing, or, you know, whatever the type of writing is that they're being assessed by. So I think in comparison to other teachers, I don't think this is the case for all teachers who aren't writers, but I think actively being a writer and thinking about different types of writing does help you value different types of writing as a teacher, perhaps more than if you were only being guided by the assessments that you're told you have to give.
And it's almost impossible to require a 5-paragraph essay that follows those really specific outlines. Like the third sentence of the fourth paragraph must do X. Like if you've written yourself, you know that that's malarkey. Like the fourth sentence of the fourth paragraph is going to do what it wants. So yeah, short answer would be yes. I would also add that I probably, being a writer and then going into the current educational climate probably leads me to feeling frustrated more often than imaginative, because we are going to headbutt against the, constant assessment walls.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll add, because I've spoken mostly about teaching creative writing, which is an elective, but that's been 1 or 2 sections of my 6 every year for, 7 years. And then before that, there was no creative writing. And what I found now is that, like, as I'm thinking more like as a writer in the craft of writing, as in non, sort of like academic writing or that sort, is that I'm bringing in a lot of my creative writing lessons into my English classes. And so, like, an example, I just recently gave kids a choice for this paper. I said basically either you write a research paper or you're going to be writing a fiction piece. And in this English class, without giving them instruction on fiction, they all wanted to just write the research paper. And the reason is just because they knew it and because therefore it's easier, right? And so now what I'm doing in that same class is I'm actually teaching them some of the craft of fiction. Like I have a whole lesson on like how to write dialogue. And talking about tags and talking about, like having less is more, and thinking about like the actual, way people speak is not necessarily complete sentences, that there's a lot of incomplete thoughts. And can you write that in dialogue? And they are really getting into it, but it's a different type of writing. And so I think coming back to then me as a writer is that if I am not engaged in the process of being a creative writer, of trying to write prose, of trying to write poetry, I'm not going to be able to teach that to them either.
I love hearing that, Thomas. I think one of the things, I came from a background teaching all creative writing, and Florida State University has 600 creative writing majors, which I kind of wonder, what other skill are we going to learn here, in the course of this? And one thing, this is where my fascination with being able to teach imagination came from. But when I started at Monticello, I was surprised how many 15, 16, 17-year-olds had kind of already shut down on imagination. Thomas, what you said about the research papers, wanting to do kind of the known quantity instead of exploring in unknown terrain, really rings true. And I love that. I'm encouraged here hearing how much, I guess I wouldn't have guessed before this panel, how much writing informs our teaching for all 5 of us. And it makes me think, wouldn't we encourage everyone who's teaching English to do some writing? We think, what would we think of an English teacher who didn't ever read a book, right? We'd say, well, goodness, you probably should read a book. But it seems like it would be, I wonder what would happen if English teachers were encouraged, and I think that confidence, that courage it takes to do it, Angela, just kind of saying, I'm going to put those words down there over and over. And all of you guys, just how much we're, willing to face that beast and say, I'm going to do it. I think that'd be a wonderful thing.
We're getting close to hitting our time limit here. So one thing that's kind of come up a few times is this notion of like the sharing and feedback and whatnot. So it sounds like we've all created community for our students in some way and like kind of made it a bit more welcoming, lower the stakes a little bit with the creative stuff. How do you all do that for yourselves? Like, how do you polish a piece of your own writing?
I think that's two separate questions.
In my head, there was a bridge, but it didn't come through. So as I said it, I'm like, I missed a transition.
Yeah, I think that is kind of part of the conversation that we've left out, that it's not only modeling your vulnerability by writing and sharing with your students that you write, but also the act of getting feedback as a writer. I think, at least for me, that really heavily informs how I give feedback to my students, because we know it's like the wound is fresh for us. If you're currently writing and getting feedback from your writer friends, it's fresher than it is maybe for other teachers who are not actively writing and getting feedback. So I feel like, at least for me, it helps me be more thoughtful about the types of feedback that I give. I'm not going to give 5 different criticisms and no encouragement. I'm going to see the beauty in my students' writing and try to look into where their potential is and try to guide them toward that potential, rather than just marking up everything I see with a red pen. So for me, that helps me both to give better feedback to my students, but also to take feedback better, because I know how I'm writing feedback for my students with good intentions. So when I get feedback from friends on my writing and I'm feeling a little defensive at first, it helps me digest that feedback as well, and work on revising my own writing.
I think for me, something that, as Shannon was talking about it, is that honestly, getting the feedback has also really informed the type of writing that I ask my students to do. Because if you don't care about what you're writing, you don't care about the feedback. Yeah. And so I've really tried then, like, the wound is fresh when someone is pulling apart my poem, because I spent my 32 drafts before I even shared it, right? And so I then really do try and build for kids, based on my own experience with receiving the feedback, making sure that then they're caring about what they're writing about, and finding a way with student choice and finding some ways to encourage them to have creative voice, to then care about it, to then receive feedback.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think too, I was talking about a broader definition of writing, and I come back to that carpenter who posts videos of how to frame a house and frame a roof that I found so helpful. And I think one of the things I've been trying to do with my students is to expand my definition of what it is to be a writer, to be creative and imaginative, because for some of them, the page is just not where they're most comfortable. And it's wonderful. We live in an environment right now where they can do this through a variety of means. So that's something I try to be aware of too, is the potential to share their words in other ways if they're more comfortable doing that.
Yeah, that it's a creative process, not necessarily just a writing process, right? There's multiple ways that we communicate in today's world, and writing's kind of back. For a while, I've been teaching long enough. I used to say that visual's the future, but then through all the most of that social media is very verbal, not just visual. So I feel like writing has made a comeback in some different ways than when I first started teaching. Does anybody have any other comments for the Q&A part for each other before we shift gears here at the end of our session?
This is neither a Q nor an A, but I think just the part of your question I didn't address, and we kind of got away from, was the writing communities for ourselves as teachers, and just the fact that that is so important to keep yourself going and keep yourself from being discouraged. I think is having other people that you're struggling through it with, and to encourage you and to encourage them in return.
Yeah, I would do a quick piggyback to add that that can look a lot of different ways too. Again, to call back to my experience in a writing project site at Red Cedar, we've had people form their own writing groups where they are feedback loops. Basically, we're just talking about feedback, and they exist to give each other feedback. I've seen other groups and been part of other groups where it's really just generative. Like you have to defend writing time in your life, right? So if you put it on a calendar, then you must write. So writing groups can serve different purposes. And I have a friend who's in like 3 different writing groups. Like she has her generative group, and then she has her feedback group, and then she has a group that's been writing since like 8th grade together. So the group is itself a very amorphous term, so find a community that does what you need that community to do, I guess I would say.
I'll add also that like I don't go very far for my writing group. Like I've approached Paul after school before and just been like, hey, I wrote this poem. Can you sit down with me for 10 minutes here and let's talk about it together? And the same with Shannon and a couple other colleagues. Like I absolutely believe in the creativity and the ability of my colleagues. And so when I need a group, I've got one right there.
Yeah, I would leave a question up for anybody who's watching still at this point. How can we encourage that community among English teachers? How could we, so if the bar is high for a lot of teachers to write, and we're busy, so much going on. We're exhausted at the end of the day with kids and grading and everything else. And I wonder, how could we, who are writing, encourage other teachers to join us? I don't have an answer to that, but maybe that's an answer we could hear from some of our listeners.
Talk amongst yourselves. In all seriousness, so that's probably a good segue, because we do have contact info for ourselves throughout this. So, feel free to reach out to any of us, and especially if you're on Twitter. Twitter's been a pretty common contact. We've mentioned, for writers on here already. And the wrap-up chunk of our session is that in that slide deck, we have some writing prompts. Each of us are bringing a writing prompt to the session. So I'm going to take Paul's comment as a good segue to that last chunk of our show here, which is an invitation to write. My answer to Paul's question would basically be, how do you get started? Like, how do you write? How do you do it? You just do it. You get started, and it'll be lousy. And if you do it long enough, you've got the 10,000 hours, and it's not that lousy anymore. And so we invite you to start writing. So back to the screen share. These are available for you here. We've got a prompt from each of us, so check them out and visit them on your own. But I want to throw it to Thomas for the wrap up, because his requires an introduction. So Thomas, take us home.
Sure. And so thank you everybody first for attending and for keeping your computer screen on for the past 60 minutes while we spoke. So I'm inviting you to be a part of our writing community. And so if you have gone to the bit.ly that was on our slides, Mitch, maybe if you wanted to give everybody just a second to see that bit.ly again. So once you're there on our slides, I have a hyperlink called Life of NCTE Session Towns. And this is essentially based on a writing prompt that I do I've done it with my creative writing classes. I've also actually done this in several of my regular ed level English classes. And so it's based on an Anne Carson poem. Essentially, she has a preamble talking about all of these different towns. And so I'm asking you to please go join, and as you've read her poem, mimic her style of prose and voice, and try to write a Life of NCTE Session Town poem on our document. So whichever is your fancy, try and add it to the document here at the bottom. And then by the end of all of us joining, hopefully we do have a bank of our own sort of life of towns here that we've created together. Thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thomas.